Right, just give everyone a few minutes to get logged on. Sorry, I'm a couple of minutes late. We had a few technical issues at the start there. Hope you can all hear me clearly. Our marketing executive Shanice is monitoring the Q&A's section. So if you do have any issues and you can't hear anything, please let her know, and she'll be able to advise. There will be a Q&A session at the end. Also, the link will be available for anyone who wants to review the webinar afterwards as well. I'm going to be switching a bit between the presentation and also some Excel sheets to explain how best to optimize data. So I think with the majority of participants now online, we will progress. So today's webinar, the second one of the summer, is how to make sense of your mass data to find your diamond in the rough. For those that don't know who I am, my name is David Adams. I'm the head of business development and account management here at White Label Dating. I've been here for 8 years. I've spent the majority of those years in the partner team as a partner manager in my very early days, and progressing through to now leading the division over the last couple of years. So before we begin, it's worth talking about what are the benefits of using pivot tables. The majority of this presentation is going to be about pivot tables, how to use them, and how to manage mass volumes of data. So I hope you're all ready to geek out on data and find it all interesting and useful. It is super crucial to be able to understand how to interpret data and how to manage mass volumes of data when running any sort of marketing campaigns. Now, we're talking about a hell of a lot of characteristic, demographic, conversion-based data across all of our campaigns and sites that we do run. So being able to manage that data effectively is vital, and pivot tables are a great way to do that. So the main benefits of a pivot table: they allow you to shape your acquisition strategy through finding danger areas, highlighting success areas, and identifying opportunities. Ultimately, all of these allow you to optimize your marketing campaigns with the goal of growing your revenues. So what is a pivot table? A pivot table is a tool that allows you to organize your mass data. They allow for the creation of meaningful tables and graphs from thousands of rows of data. They permit you to explore trends based upon your data sets and allow grouping together of metrics and easy comparison. What do we use pivot tables for? The majority of the time we use a pivot table in the partner team and across White Label Dating is when we're looking at campaign tracking. This is the largest amount of data realistically that we ever look at. All of our partners drive relatively high volumes of traffic, which comes with it a large proportion of data. And what we do internally is we export this data from our database. And what that does is it provides a large volume of data at source, campaign, and keyword level. As I said, it's the most commonly used data set by the partner team, and it is vital for in-depth campaign analysis. When we export this data from the database, it comes out at a member level. So every row on these spreadsheets represents the lifetime of a member and any of their activities and any of the information they provided to us. Now, what that does do is it provides a wealth of information for you to be able to analyze and optimize your campaigns off the back of. But what it also presents is a bit of an issue when trying to analyze that data. If you're delivering, 4-figure registrations per day, or even 3 or 2-figure registrations a day, then we're talking about in some instances hundreds of thousands of rows of data if we're looking over a longer period of time. So a pivot table allows you to look at that data in a way you can actually interpret it. So the key benefits of using pivot tables to analyze campaign tracking data: you can find danger areas within your marketing campaigns. So again, at a source, campaign, and keyword level, are there any elements of your campaigns that are generating a negative or even non-existent ROI? Which elements of your campaigns have the lowest basic and full conversion rates? Which elements generate subscriptions that do not rebill? and which elements generate registrations that have a high cost but do not convert. All of these areas, you know, push them all together, and you've got an ultimate view of how best to optimize your marketing strategy and ultimately generate profit for all of our partners and marketeers alike. It allows you to highlight success areas to guide your campaign growth. So again, source campaign and keyword level, which of these campaigns are targeting members that generate the best ROI, which are targeting members that generate the highest IRPB and TRPB. For those that were on last time, you'll remember that stands for initial revenue per basic and total revenue per basic. Just to review on those quickly, so just to be clear, initial revenue per basic is the amount of initial revenue collected divided by the number of registrations in a time period. And again, so the total revenue per basic is exactly the same as that, but it includes reinitials, rebills, and also includes the deduction of refunds and chargebacks as well. So you get a true idea as to what your registrations generate over a period of time. And thus it allows you to compare that to your cost per acquisition for a registration. And then you can work out what your gross margin is and eventual profit. And finally, you can find out ways to generate registrations from members with the strongest basic and full conversion rates. And finally, what this report allows you to do is you can look at the length of time from registration to subscription. If you can find the campaigns that generate the fastest upgrade from registration, you will be able to grow more aggressively because you can collect that initial revenue faster, therefore reinvest it and repeat that process over and over, and therefore grow faster. You can also look at which package a member opts for. So if you've got a particular campaign and it's heavily weighted to 1 month subscribers, you may want to try and flip around that acquisition expenditure to campaigns where users are taking more of a 3-month or a 6-month subscription, which will then in turn give you a greater LTV and a healthier package mix. We don't want campaigns which are heavily weighted to 1 month subscriptions because they tend to have a lower LTV than those users who choose a longer subscription. And also you can look at the refund and chargeback propensity by campaign. So how you would use that. If you've got a campaign that has a very high refund percentage, when you're looking at refund versus initial, that may suggest that the user or the member felt like they were going to get one experience on the site, whereas in reality, when they hit the site, they didn't receive the kind of experience they were looking for, which then would in turn encourage them to refund. And if you can find that information out at a campaign or a keyword level, it will allow you to restructure those campaigns to remove all of these kind of wastage areas that ultimately eat into your profit. And remember, I'm sure all of you are aware of this, but it's the campaign that generates the most revenue, it's not always the most profitable. So this kind of data, it needs to be used in conjunction with your acquisition reports to truly get an idea as to the profitability of your spend. So how to create a pivot table. I'm going to go away from the presentation now and open up a spreadsheet. Now, what we have here is a spreadsheet of data that we've totally anonymized. We've coded up the sources, the campaigns, and the keywords, and the site names as well. And the reason why we've done this, I wanted to use a true data set to be able to give a real life example of how this data can be used. And in this screen share, we're going to look at how easy it is to view initial revenue per basic by site and by campaign source and keyword. Now, when manipulating raw data with pivot tables, you open up a lot more possibilities than looking at pre-made reports. Here, I've got the ability to create my own metrics by certain criteria based upon what I want to look at. Now, you can see here that this spreadsheet is quite extensive. I'm dragging it down there, and we're looking at 5,000-6,000 plus rows of data. Now, trying to extract any sort of conclusions from this can be quite difficult. So to manage this, we need to use a pivot table. Now, to create a pivot table, you need to highlight the data, insert a pivot table. Now, what you then have is you have this table on the right-hand side here, filters, columns, rows, and values, and then all of the individual sets of data from your previous spreadsheet. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to choose a site to analyze. And in this instance, we're going to use site number 1. So what we need to do here is we need to put site name into filters. And then we'll choose site number 1. So now what that's done is it's restricted the data that I can then pull in by anything by site number 1. We want to look at initial revenue and registrations to create our initial revenue per basic column. These are the values that we want to analyze. So these data points move into the bottom right-hand corner. So you take your basic registrations and you need to change that to sum of, so it adds them all up. And then we want to look at initial revenue to create initial revenue per basic. And again, we want to add all those up. So what you end up with is a set of data that includes 2,053 registrations, of which have generated £1,786 initial revenue so far. Now, this data set is from a couple of months ago, so that has matured over time. Now, we want to analyze these metrics at a campaign level. So the final step in the process of what we want to do is we want to drag campaign down into rows. And then suddenly what we have here is these campaigns have generated these registrations and subsequently has generated this amount of initial revenue. Now, the ultimate metric we're trying to figure out here is initial revenue per basic. So what we then need to do is create what's referred to as a calculated field. So with one of the rows highlighted in the pivot table, you select fields, items, and sets and go calculated field. We're then going to call this IRPB, and we're going to take the initial revenue and we're going to divide it by the number of basics. And what you then have here is a calculation of the data that the pivot table is pulling on. We've turned it into GBP for ease. And then what we have here is the perfect table that we can then start to expand and play with. And one thing that you will want to look at this kind of level is the terms which appear within these campaigns. And the reason why pivot tables are so useful is because you literally take the referral text, which is the keyword, drag it down into the rows, and then suddenly all of the keywords appear here: number of registrations, initial revenue, and the subsequent initial revenue per basic, which is a very quick, easy way. And if you sort that by largest to smallest, you then have the largest initial revenue generating campaigns at the top. And it tells you here what those terms then generate in initial revenue per basic. And if you then turn that into a monetary figure, you can then start to relay that information to your advertising campaigns. And relatively quickly, you've got an idea as to what your ROI may be or go on to be once the lifetime value matures. So we'll now go back to the presentation. So what else can we look at when it comes to pivot tables and this specific data set? The other kind of key information that this CT or campaign tracking report can tell us by using pivot tables is how lifetime value matures over time to forecast a return on the traffic you're acquiring right now. You know, the traffic you acquire last month may not return a profit this month. It's quite unlikely it will do. We know that lifetime value over 3, 6, 9 months is where the return comes. But getting an idea as to what your traffic is worth after maybe a year can encourage you to feel more confident to continue investing. And this report and the way I'm going to show you how to build the pivot table now will show you what that traffic is worth now after, say, 10 to 12 months. So I think we'll head offline again, back to the Excel sheet. Now, what we've got here is an even more extensive pivot set of data. Sorry, this is all of the traffic over a 12-month period. And with this data, we're going to look at LTV by campaign over a time period. I said this is important as it allows us to develop an idea as to when you will see the ROI and how long it might take to generate the LTV. So with this data, there's a particular site that we're going to look at. And we want to try and look back to September, October time last year and the traffic that was acquired during those months to see what that traffic is actually worth now. So same as before, we take the data set, we highlight it, and we insert a pivot table. As we did before, we need to try and filter some of this data so we're only looking at exactly what we want to look at. So the filters that we're going to add here are going to be year, month, and site name. And before we start putting data into this set, what we're going to do is we're going to filter these out. So because we're looking at September to October last year, we're going to include 2018. We're going to look at September and October. And the site name is site number 72. So now what that filter's done is it's restricted the data that the pivot table can pull on. And when we're looking at LTV, we're going to look at two different metrics to what we looked at last time. And these are upgrades. And we're going to look at total revenue as well. And as we did before, we're going to sum up both of these data sets. Okay, so now what we can see here is we've got 78 upgrades on site 72 from those 2 months worth of acquisition, which are now worth £88,305. And we want to analyze these metrics by campaign because we want to try and figure out what an overall LTV is at a campaign level. So we're going to pull campaign from the list of fields to add, and we're going to put it in there. So what we can see here is that campaign 214 generated 64 upgrades, and over the last 10 months, those 64 upgrades have generated, inclusive of initial, reinitial, and rebill, £6,872. Now, that isn't an LTV yet, as I'm sure you know, so we need to do another calculated field. So we leave the box highlighted there, we go to fields, items, and sets, calculated field, we title it LTV, and the formula we're going to take is total revenue divided by number of upgrades. And what we have then is an LTV figure, which I'm sure most of you can now familiarize yourself with. LTV figures are broadly between £90 and £120 after a set period of time. And we can see here that campaign 214 has generated an LTV of £107.38. Campaign 226 has generated an LTV of £115.18. Now, you will be acquiring traffic at a campaign level, so this is, or even at a keyword level, and theoretically you can take this data down at an LTV level to a term, so to a specific keyword. So when you receive this data from your partner manager, feel free to complete the same process as we did last time, where you take the term and put it down underneath campaign, and then if we sort these by largest to smallest, you will see then that these individual keywords here have generated this number of upgrades, and over the last 10 months, that's how much they've generated. Now, it's worth highlighting here that this might not necessarily be the most profitable keyword. Even though it's generated the highest LTV of £127, it may also be the most expensive to acquire. So always bear in mind that you've got to marry this data up with your own acquisition data as well. Now, the other way we can use this type of data when looking at LTV over time is looking at how LTV matures. Now, if you take data from last month, for example, it won't have generated as much of an LTV as the traffic from 10 months ago. The reason for that, last month's traffic has only had 1 month to convert and therefore rebill. Traffic from 10 months ago has had almost a year to initial, then rebill, potentially cancel, and then come back and reinitial. And all of that revenue collected together is what generates that high LTV. So what we'll do now is we'll remove campaign and term from the pivot table. And we want to start looking at, say, for example, over time, what happens to traffic from October to November to December, how much does it increase by? So we limit the pivot table to October, November, and December, and then pull the month down into rows. And what you can then see there is how lifetime value matures over time. December's traffic that generated those 40 upgrades is worth £81 now per upgrade. Whereas if you go back to October, it's had an extra couple of months to rebill, therefore it's now up to 116. And what you will see is this, this just goes up and up and up over time until ultimately all of the upgrades that have come from a particular group of traffic or a group of registrations will eventually all fall out of full membership, and then you'll generate your final LTV. But as we all know, that can take many years. We have subscribers on our platform that stay for 2, 3, 4 years. So it's when you're looking at large volumes of data, it's unlikely that people will completely fall out and you'll end up with a 0 number. So back again to the presentation. The final thing I wanted to show you today with pivot tables is how to copy and compare pivot tables. So once you've created one pivot table, you can copy it, paste it next to it, and then you've got the ability to compare the same set of data based upon different demographics. So you can compare gender, device, sources. You can apply a performance metric via those demographics or characteristics. And we do this again all through the use of pivot tables and the same data set. Final time, I'll take you off the presentation now to look at this campaign data again. I'm just going to delete that previous pivot table there, and we're back to the same set of data. So, as I said, when comparing data on demographics, it can be useful to have 2 data sets alongside each other. And simply copy and pasting pivot tables is very easy and it's very useful. So we grab the data, we insert a pivot table, and then we start building our first thing that we're going to compare here. So for this example, we're going to use site 2. So we'll put the site name down in the filter again, and we'll select site number 2. We want to generate initial revenue per basic by campaign. So as we did before, we need to add basics down into the values box, and we need to add initial revenue down there as well. And again, we need to sum those up. So what we end up with is site number 2 that's generated 503 registrations and subsequently has generated £942 of initial revenue. We're going to look at this by campaign. So as we did previously, pull the campaign down into there. And what we then have is these campaigns have generated these registrations, which has generated this initial revenue. Now, finally, what we're going to do is we're going to create another one of those calculated fields. And we're going to call it initial revenue per basic. And we're going to take initial revenue divided by the number of basics. And there you have initial revenue per basic. We'll turn that into pounds so it's easy to interpret. So these campaigns here, 294 registrations have generated £1.12. That's what's that showing us. Now, once you've got this basic pivot table, what you need to do is a simple copy and paste alongside it. And just for ease, I'm just going to zoom out ever so slightly. So what we've then got here is these 2 pivot tables. They're exactly the same. There's nothing different between them. Now, what we're going to look at is the difference between gender. So on the left-hand side here, we've got selected site number 2, and we're going to add gender into the filter at the top. We'll do the same on this one. And we'll have females on the left, and we'll have males on the right. Now, what this shows us is that for this particular site, campaign 10, as an example, generates £1.33 initial revenue per basic when acquiring females. Campaign 10 for males, on the other hand, generates 85p, or 84p rather, initial revenue per basic when acquiring males. So this shows us that females generate 40% more initial revenue per basic than males. Therefore, you can either afford to spend somewhere in the region of 40% more to acquire female traffic, or vice versa, you spend less to acquire male traffic. And that's how you use comparison pivot tables to quickly extract key pieces of information that can allow you to truly minimize wastage on your campaigns. And by minimizing wastage, it allows you to invest more aggressively and therefore grow. Now, we can do the same thing here with mobile and desktop. So we will add everyone back in to both of these pivot tables. Take those two filters out and add in device. Again, exactly the same on both pivot tables. We'll have desktop on the left here, and we'll have mobile on the right. Now, what we can see here is a data set that represents a well-optimized ad campaign or account. The reason we can see this is that for mobile, you're on campaign 10, the initial revenue per basic is £1.12 of 293 registrations. Now over here, on campaign 10, you've got one registration. Therefore, the person acquiring traffic in this way knows that whatever campaign 10 is attracting, it doesn't perform well on desktop. Therefore, the bid adjustment has been brought right down to ensure that campaign 10 is optimized. And that's how we can compare data quickly with pivot tables. We've looked at mobile and gender, but there's a number of different demographics you can look at, a number of different metrics. It doesn't always have to be initial revenue per basic. It can be whatever you choose and use best when optimizing your campaigns. Back to the presentation now for the final time. So key takeaways from today. Pivot tables are vital for in-depth analysis. They make impossible data sets manageable. They summarize data quickly and easily. They help you shape your acquisition strategy, optimize your marketing campaigns to grow your revenues, and ultimately they analyze data in a way that you can understand it. We're all different at the end of the day. Our minds all work differently. And sometimes out-of-the-box reports can serve day-to-day, but those key pieces of analysis, sometimes you need to manipulate that data how your mind works. And ultimately, a pivot table is the best way to do that. How can we help you? We're on hand at all times to provide these data sets, not just this one particular data set. We have a number of reports that are available to us, and ultimately we are here to ensure that you optimize your campaigns and have the support and the data needed to do that, to ensure that you get the best ROI, carry on investing, everybody wins. And that's ultimately what I've just said there. So campaign tracking data at a granular level in a raw data format. We can help build pivot tables to interpret your data, and ultimately help you find where you need to streamline and optimize your campaigns to grow your revenues. So on to the Q&A. I'm not sure if anyone's been putting any questions in throughout. 5 questions in here so far. Okay, right. So what we're going to do, we'll start with the first question there. All of these seem to be anonymous today, so I'll just read out the question and then provide an answer. So in an ideal world, would I be aiming for an IRPB to equal my CPL and my CPA to equal my TRPB? Almost. An IRPB is what you'll generate initial revenue per basic within the first maybe 30 days, 60 days from the initial revenue after the user has been given the time to convert. Total revenue per basic is what it generates over time. And in terms of a CPL or a CPA, it all depends on how you run your acquisition. If you run your acquisition based upon a cost per lead, then ultimately you would want your CPL to equal your or be less than your total revenue per basic. From a CPA perspective, if we're talking about acquiring a full member or a subscriber, your CPA should be less than what your LTV is. Another question there, confused about what goes in what box. Of course, the partner managers will be on hand at all times to be able to guide you through this. I'd recommend getting some video calls booked in with your partner managers. We can do screen shares, talk you through all of these steps. Can you create a calculated field to show me other things like total revenue per basic? Calculated fields can be used for anything to merge two cells of data together to calculate any sort of metrics from the data that exists there. So yeah, for sure. Calculated fields can be used for anything. If the data exists in the pivot table, it can be calculated. Another question there, what other filters could help with looking at my campaigns? One of the things you may want to look at when looking at your campaigns is age range. What we see massively across the platform is that age ranges convert very differently. But likewise, different ages can sometimes cost more or less to acquire. So just because people between the ages of 18 to 35 might convert less, it doesn't mean they shouldn't be targeted, because they may be cheaper to acquire. And final question there. How far back can you pull the data from my portfolio? We can pull this campaign data back to 18 months ago. So you'll get a real good idea as to how the data matures. And after 18 months, I'm sure we'd all like to get our return on investment faster than 18 months. So it's worth focusing on that traffic that does come within 18 months. Question there, does it matter that we are looking at data from last year with an ever-changing industry? It depends. There are certain sectors of the industry that change very quickly. There are certain sectors of the industry that might not change so fast. So if you have a relatively solid campaign that you've been running for a period of time, well over a year, and I'm aware of partners and acquisition experts that have the campaigns running for longer than that, yeah, it can be relevant to look at up to a year or even beyond. But as ever, the answer is annoyingly, it depends. And the final question we'll take for today then is there a minimum number of basics that a campaign or source receives for me to confidently act on the findings? I think ultimately this depends on the partner or the acquisition expert as to how risk averse they are. If you set up a campaign and you maybe acquire 30 or 40 registrations or spend 100, 150, 200 pounds on a particular campaign, then it may get to a point where you have your own cutoff. And every affiliate or acquisition expert will have their own cutoff. So ultimately that does depend on the partner. So I think that's it now for the Q&A. So we'll move on, and I'll say thanks to everyone for attending. I hope you found it useful and not too data heavy. As I said, we're always very happy to help out where we can and guide you through this. So reach out to your partner manager if you do need any support. And the next webinar next month is going to be on how to broaden your acquisition strategy. So tune in for that. There'll be an email going out to register your interest. Thanks again for attending. I'll see you next time.